The streets of downtown Baltimore bustled with life as the evening settled in. The sun had dipped below the skyline, leaving behind a golden haze that shimmered against the glass buildings. Angela Carter adjusted the sleeves of her tailored navy blue blazer as she stepped out of the sleek black Cadillac Escalade. She had just finished a long day of legislative meetings and policy discussions at the Capitol, and now she was in town for a charity gala benefiting underprivileged communities, one of many events she attended as part of her ongoing efforts to enact meaningful change. She took a deep breath, the cool autumn air filling her lungs as she smoothed her skirt and pulled her purse close. The parking lot of the high-end restaurant was quiet, with only a few luxury vehicles dotting the spaces. It was a refined neighborhood, predominantly affluent and mostly white. As she closed her car door, she caught sight of a figure standing near a police cruiser at the end of the block. The officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and sharp blue eyes, was watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. Sergeant Jack Reynolds had been patrolling this neighborhood for nearly a decade. He had seen all kinds of people come and go, but there was something about this woman that made him pause. It wasn't the way she carried herself, poised, confident, almost regal. It wasn't the elegant outfit or the gleaming Escalade. No, it was something else, something deeper, something instinctual. He couldn't quite place it. But the sight of a black woman stepping out of such an expensive car in this particular neighborhood sent a small spark of suspicion through him. Jack had been a cop long enough to know that criminals came in all shapes and sizes. He prided himself on not being one of those officers, the ones people accused of racial profiling. But instincts were instincts, and his instincts told him something was off. He pushed off his cruiser and started toward her, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement. Angela noticed him immediately. She straightened, her expression composed but wary. "Evening, ma'am," Jack said, stopping a few feet from her. His tone was firm but neutral. Angela glanced at him. "Good evening, officer." Jack's gaze flickered to the car behind her, then back to her. "That your vehicle?" She arched an eyebrow. "Yes. Mind if I see some ID?" Angela felt her muscles tense. This wasn't her first encounter with an officer who made assumptions based on skin color rather than circumstance. She knew the script by heart. "May I ask why you need to see my identification?" she asked. Keeping her tone even, Jack crossed his arms. "Just a routine check. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Angela studied him for a moment. He was lying. There was no suspicious activity, just his own prejudice guiding his actions. "This is a secure, private parking lot," she said. "Are you checking the identification of every person who parks here tonight? Or just mine?" Jack exhaled through his nose. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. Now, if you could hand over your ID, I'd appreciate it." Angela could feel the heat rising in her chest, a familiar anger she had long since learned to temper. She reached into her purse and retrieved her driver's license. Handing it to him without another word, Jack took it, glancing at the name. "Angela Carter," he muttered. He looked back at her. "What brings you to this part of town?" Angela's patience was wearing thin. "Dinner." Jack studied her face, then her ID again. He lingered, as if waiting for something, some reason to escalate the situation. Angela met his gaze, unwavering. Jack finally nodded, handing back the ID. "All right, you're free to go." Angela took the card and slid it back into her purse. She didn't thank him. She simply turned and walked toward the restaurant. Her heartbeat steady but her mind racing. She had done nothing wrong. And yet she had been stopped, questioned, scrutinized. Jack watched her go, his jaw tightening. Something about the encounter gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. Another routine stop, nothing more. He had no idea how wrong he was. Angela had barely taken a few steps toward the restaurant when she heard heavy footsteps behind her. "Hold on a second," Jack called out. She stopped, turning slowly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Jack frowned. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His gut told him there was more to this woman than met the eye. "I need to ask you a few more questions," he said. Angela folded her arms. "I believe you just said I was free to go." Jack's patience thinned. He had seen this kind of defiance before, people who thought they were above scrutiny. He wasn't going to let this woman challenge his authority. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put your hands where I can see them." Angela's expression darkened. "Excuse me?" You're acting suspicious, Jack said. I need to make sure you're not carrying anything illegal. Angela took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. I am a United States Senator. You are making a grave mistake. Jack's eyes flickered with disbelief. Then amusement. Is that so? A senator? He let out a short laugh. And I suppose you think that makes you untouchable? Angela clenched her fists. It means I know my rights. Jack wasn't listening. His paranoia was escalating, fueled by his own ingrained biases. In his mind, he saw a defiant black woman refusing to comply. That was enough. Before she could react, he grabbed her by the arm. The movement was swift, forceful. Angela stumbled, gasping as she felt herself being yanked backward. Get your hands off me, she snapped. Struggling against his grip, Jack shoved her against the hood of her own car. Stop resisting, he barked. I am not resisting, she shouted. Jack ignored her. He pressed her face against the cold metal and reached for his cuffs. Angela could hear the distant gasps of bystanders, the murmurs of disbelief. You think you're special? Jack growled. You think you can walk around like you own the place? Newsflash, you don't. Angela gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged spurts. Officer, a voice called out. What the hell are you doing? Jack ignored it. He didn't see the people pulling out their phones, recording every second of the assault. He didn't see the expressions of horror on their faces. He didn't see his career slipping through his fingers. Angela's wrists were locked in cold steel cuffs as Jack finally stepped back, breathing heavily. Now, let's see some real ID, he muttered. Angela turned her head, glaring at him with an intensity that made him pause. Look inside my purse, she said, her voice eerily calm. Jack hesitated, but then reached down and pulled out her wallet. He flipped it open and froze. There it was, her official Senate identification card. Senator Angela Carter. His stomach twisted. His world had just come crashing down. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. The streetlights cast a pale glow over the scene, illuminating the stunned expression on Jack Reynolds's face as he stared at the ID in his hands. The golden seal of the United States Senate gleamed under the artificial light, mocking him. Senator Angela Carter. Jack's breath hitched. His fingers tightened around the wallet as his mind struggled to process the reality of what he had just done. Angela, still bent against the hood of her car, exhaled sharply. Her wrists ached from the tight metal of the cuffs, but she barely noticed the pain. Instead, she watched the officer before her, reading every flicker of emotion that crossed his face: confusion, realization, and then something else: fear. Jack swallowed hard, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. A small crowd had gathered. Cell phones were pointed in his direction, recording everything. Angela saw them: an elderly white couple standing in disbelief, a young black woman whose hands trembled as she filmed, two teenage boys exchanging incredulous glances. Angela's voice was measured, but the force of her words hit like a hammer. Now, Officer Reynolds, are you going to uncuff me? Or do I need to make a phone call and have half of the Justice Department here in 5 minutes? Jack's jaw clenched. He knew he was in deep trouble. But his pride, his stubbornness, his entire sense of power, made him hesitate. A second officer, a younger black man with short cropped hair and a tense expression, pushed his way through the gathering crowd. His badge read Officer Malcolm Harris. Sergeant Reynolds, he said sharply. What the hell is going on here? Jack hesitated, shifting his weight. She was acting suspicious. Harris cut him off, his gaze darting from Jack to the handcuffed senator. His face paled when he saw the ID in Jack's hand. Oh my God, Harris breathed. Senator Carter. He turned back to Jack, disbelief in his eyes. You arrested a sitting U.S. senator? Jack opened his mouth, but no words came out. Angela flexed her fingers. I suggest you remove these cuffs before you make this any worse than it already is. Malcolm didn't wait for Jack to respond. He reached for the key on Jack's belt and swiftly unlocked the cuffs. As soon as her wrists were free, Angela pulled her arms in front of her, rubbing the sore skin. Jack took a step back, his face burning with humiliation. Angela turned, standing tall. The tension in the air was thick, electric. The bystanders watched, waiting for the next moment, for the fallout that was surely coming. You just put your hands on a senator of the United States, she said, her voice low and filled with steel. You shoved me. You insulted me. You cuffed me, on the suspicion of what? Exactly? Walking while black? Jack's lips pressed into a thin line. He could still feel the weight of every phone camera recording him. I was doing my job, he said stiffly. Angela let out a short, humorless laugh. Your job? Your job is to serve and protect. Your job is to uphold the law, not to abuse it. I complied. I gave you my ID. And yet, somehow, that wasn't enough for you. Jack's fists clenched at his sides. But before he could form another excuse, Malcolm Harris stepped in front of him, effectively blocking him from Angela. Senator Carter, Malcolm said, his voice apologetic. Are you all right? Angela met his gaze. Unlike Jack, this man's eyes held no arrogance, only concern. I'll be fine, she said. But this? She gestured toward Jack. This will not go unanswered. Her words rang in the night air, heavy with promise. Jack felt his stomach twist. Angela turned to the crowd. Did everyone get that on video? A chorus of, yes, ma'am, and, we got it, filled the air. Good, she said. Then, fixing her gaze back on Jack, she added, because this isn't over. With that, she turned and walked toward the restaurant. Her head held high, leaving Jack standing there, exposed, humiliated, and, for the first time, afraid. Behind him, Malcolm exhaled and muttered, Jesus Christ, Jack, you're done. And Jack knew it. The storm had only just begun. Angela Carter sat at a dimly lit table inside the upscale restaurant, her hands still tingling from the cuffs that had only just been removed. The murmurs of other guests filled the air, but her mind was elsewhere. Across from her, Senator Mark Holloway, a longtime colleague and ally, studied her face with a mixture of anger and concern. Are you all right? He asked. Leaning forward, Angela took a sip of water, allowing herself a moment to breathe. I've been better, she admitted, her voice even but firm. But this isn't about me, Mark. This is about something much bigger. Mark nodded grimly. The moment I walked in, I saw people glued to their phones. That video is everywhere. I got 3 alerts from news agencies before I even sat down. Angela expected as much. The moment she walked away from that confrontation, she knew it would become a national story. And she wanted it to. This wasn't just another case of police overreach, it was proof, captured in real time, of the systemic abuse people of color faced every day. The fact that she was a U.S. senator only amplified the gravity of the situation. Her phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at it. A dozen missed calls, her chief of staff, journalists, civil rights activists, and even a few fellow senators. It had begun. Meanwhile, across the city, in the cramped break room of the police precinct, Jack Reynolds stared at his own phone, his fingers gripping it so tightly his knuckles went white. His face, his name, his actions, they were everywhere. The video had gone viral within minutes, exploding across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. News anchors dissected it in real time. Baltimore police sergeant accosts sitting U.S. senator in shocking racial profiling incident. Powerful Senator Angela Carter manhandled and cuffed by officer. Calls for investigation grow. What happens when the wrong black woman gets arrested? This officer is about to find out. Jack's stomach twisted. This was bad. Worse than he had ever imagined. He had stopped plenty of people before, some innocent, some not, but never had it escalated to this. He could already hear the storm brewing outside the precinct doors. His phone buzzed. It was his wife. He hesitated, then answered. What the hell did you do? Jack? Her voice was sharp, filled with barely contained panic. Do you have any idea what's happening right now? Your name is all over the news. Our kids are getting harassed online. Jack closed his eyes, exhaling through his nose. It's not what it looks like. Melissa, it looks like you shoved a U.S. senator into her own car and handcuffed her for no damn reason. She snapped. What the hell were you thinking? Jack had no answer. At that moment, his lieutenant, Captain Darnell Monroe, a black man with nearly 30 years in the force, stepped into the break room. His face was stony, unreadable. Reynolds, he said flatly. My office. Now. Jack knew there was no talking his way out of this. The morning after the incident, Baltimore woke up angry. By dawn, the police precinct was surrounded by protesters. Men and women, young and old, of all races, stood in front of the building holding signs that read, Justice for Angela Carter. End police brutality. We are watching. Chants echoed through the streets. The video had ignited a firestorm. And Angela's identity only made it impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another black citizen being mistreated. This was a U.S. senator. Live on camera, being assaulted by a cop. Inside the precinct, Captain Monroe's office was silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Jack sat across from his superior, his fingers laced together on his lap. Monroe's face was unreadable as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "You've really done it this time, Reynolds," Monroe finally said, his voice low, restrained. "This isn't some minor complaint we can sweep under the rug. You manhandled a sitting senator." On camera, Jack licked his lips, struggling to keep his composure. Monroe held up a hand. "Shut up, Jack. I don't want to hear it. Not this time." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "The department is under immense pressure. The mayor is breathing down our necks. The governor has called for a formal investigation. And Carter? She's not letting this go." Jack's throat tightened. "Sir, Monroe leaned forward, his expression suddenly deadly serious. "You need to understand what's happening here. You're not just some cop who got caught making a bad judgment call. You're a symbol now, and people are out for blood." Jack swallowed hard. "What happens next?" Monroe sighed. "As of now, you're on unpaid leave. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation. And Jack looked up. You'd better get yourself a damn good lawyer." In Washington, D.C., Angela Carter sat in her congressional office, her phone pressed to her ear. On the other end of the line was Attorney General Vanessa Holloway. "Vanessa," Angela said, her voice unwavering, "I need you to make sure that officer faces real consequences. Not just a suspension, not just desk duty. I want charges, and I want them now." The Attorney General sighed. "Angela, you know I'm on your side. But we have to follow the process." Angela cut her off. "The process is why this keeps happening. We wait, we investigate, and then nothing changes. This time, we're doing it differently. I'm not just demanding justice for myself. I'm demanding justice for every single person who's been in my position and didn't have a camera to back them up." There was a pause. Then Vanessa said, "All right, let's make this happen." Angela hung up and turned to her chief of staff. "Call a press conference. Today." The press gathered like a swarm. Cameras flashing. Reporters pushing forward as Angela Carter stepped onto the stage. The air was thick with anticipation. She looked out at the sea of faces and took a steadying breath. Then, she spoke. "2 nights ago, I was unlawfully detained, shoved against my own car, and handcuffed like a criminal, for no reason other than the fact that I am a black woman in America." The crowd erupted in murmurs, anger simmering beneath the surface. "I wish I could say I was shocked," Angela continued, "but the truth is, this isn't new. What's new is that the world saw it happen. And I will not be silent." She looked straight into the cameras. "I am calling for serious police reform. I am calling for accountability. I am calling for that officer to face criminal charges. And I will not stop until real change happens, not just for me, but for every person who has been victimized by this system." The audience erupted. Applause. Cheers. Calls for action. Jack Reynolds sat at home, watching the press conference on his television. His stomach twisted. His entire life was about to unravel, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Jack Reynolds sat in his dimly lit living room, the glow of the television flickering against his face. His phone had been buzzing nonstop, but he didn't dare answer. His wife had taken their kids to her mother's house to escape the media frenzy, leaving him alone in a house that now felt foreign. He had watched Angela Carter's press conference in its entirety, each word sinking into him like lead. He was no longer just a cop on leave, he was a national disgrace. The news channels had dissected every second of the footage. The footage of him grabbing Carter, shoving her, handcuffing her. Some networks showed it on loop, with legal analysts picking apart every frame, questioning his intentions, his history, his judgment. The Department of Justice had announced that it was launching a full-scale investigation into the incident, and Internal Affairs was already conducting interviews. Jack turned off the television and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. His lawyer, Martin Caffrey, had advised him to lay low, to stay quiet, to not make any statements. But Jack knew that wouldn't be enough. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His heart pounded as he stood up and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, He saw two men in suits standing on his porch. FBI agents. Jack hesitated before unlocking the door. The moment he pulled it open, the taller agent, a black man with sharp, piercing eyes, held up his badge. Agent Howard Gaines, Department of Justice, he said. His partner, a younger Hispanic agent, nodded and did the same. This is Special Agent Ramirez. Sergeant Reynolds, we need to have a conversation. Jack's throat felt dry. Do I need my lawyer for this? Agent Gaines tilted his head. That depends. Do you have something to hide? Jack stepped aside, allowing them in. He had the sinking feeling that his life was about to get much worse. Angela Carter sat in a conference room at the Capitol, surrounded by fellow senators, her chief of staff, and key advisors. The energy in the room was electric. We need to strike now, said Senator Mark Holloway, his voice firm. The country is watching. We have an opportunity to pass real police reform, something that actually has teeth. Angela nodded. I agree, but we need to be strategic. We can't just propose another bill that gets watered down by the opposition. We need real systemic change. Body cams that are always on. An independent oversight committee for police misconduct. Stricter consequences for racial profiling. Her chief of staff, Lisa Porter, adjusted her glasses. The public is overwhelmingly on our side. The video was undeniable, but we're facing serious resistance from the police unions. They're already painting you as someone who hates cops and is trying to destroy law enforcement. Angela exhaled. I don't hate cops, Lisa. I hate bad cops. And if they think that means I'm their enemy, then maybe that says more about them than it does about me. Mark Holloway smirked. That's a good line. You should use that. Lisa nodded. We'll draft a statement. But Angela, we have to be prepared for what's coming next. You humiliated them, and this country is full of people who still don't believe black women belong in power. They're going to come after you, hard. Angela's jaw tightened. Let them. I'm ready. Jack Reynolds sat stiffly in the interrogation room of the Baltimore Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed above him. Across the table sat Captain Monroe, his expression unreadable. Jack had been through countless interrogations before, except this time, he was the one being investigated. Monroe folded his hands. You know why you're here. Jack nodded, his mouth dry. The footage is clear. You had no probable cause to stop her. You had no legal reason to detain her. And you damn sure had no reason to use force. So tell me, Jack, what the hell were you thinking? Jack licked his lips. He had gone over the events in his head 1,000 times, trying to find an angle that justified his actions. But the truth was, he couldn't. He had acted on instinct, and his instincts were wrong. I thought she was suspicious. He finally admitted. She was in an expensive car, in a high-end neighborhood. It didn't seem normal. Monroe's nostrils flared. Didn't seem normal? He shook his head. Jack, do you hear yourself? You profiled a United States senator because you thought she didn't belong in a rich neighborhood. Jack clenched his jaw. I didn't know who she was at the time. And that makes it better? Monroe snapped. Jack, do you know how many complaints we've had against you over the years? How many times black men and women have accused you of excessive force or unnecessary stops? Jack swallowed. Those were. Monroe slammed a folder onto the table. Bullshit. Internal Affairs is reopening every single case. And the DOJ is breathing down our necks. The mayor wants your badge. Jack. Jack sat back in his chair, his pulse hammering. So that's it? They're just going to throw me to the wolves? Monroe studied him. You threw yourself to the wolves. The room was silent. Then Monroe exhaled and leaned forward. They're offering you a deal. Resign today. Quietly. And this won't go to trial. But if you fight this, the DOJ is ready to press criminal charges. Your choice. Jack's stomach twisted. He had spent 20 years as a cop. His entire identity was wrapped up in the badge. And now, it was all slipping away. He looked up at Monroe. What would you do? Monroe didn't hesitate. I'd take the deal. Because if this goes to trial, Jack, they will destroy you. Jack closed his eyes. He was finished. Angela Carter stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, her back straight, her voice unwavering as she spoke into the microphone. This is not just about what happened to me. This is about what happens to black people in this country every single day. If it can happen to a U.S. senator, on camera, in broad daylight, then imagine what happens to the people who don't have the power to fight back. Imagine what happens when there are no cameras. The room was packed. Senators, reporters, activists. Every major news outlet was covering the hearing live. I am demanding that Sergeant Jack Reynolds be held accountable for his actions. That he not just lose his job, but that he face criminal charges for assault and unlawful detainment. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some senators nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. Angela continued, her voice gaining strength. But beyond that, I am calling for real reform. No more investigations that lead to nothing. No more slaps on the wrist. No more systemic cover-ups. We need national oversight for police misconduct. We need real consequences for officers who abuse their power. And I will not rest until we achieve that. The room erupted into applause. Angela met the gaze of the Senate Majority Leader. She could see the hesitation in his eyes. The fear. The realization that the status quo was crumbling. She smiled. This fight had just begun. Jack Reynolds sat in his car outside the Baltimore Police Department, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The city outside felt different now, hostile, unforgiving. He had spent 20 years patrolling these streets, convinced he was doing good, convinced he was making the city safer. But now, as he stared at the entrance to the building he had walked into every day for the past 2 decades, he realized the truth. He was not the hero of this story. The press had already gathered outside. Dozens of reporters, camera crews, and protesters stood by the steps of the precinct, waiting for him to step out. His name had become synonymous with police brutality, with racial profiling, with everything that was wrong with modern law enforcement. His phone buzzed. It was his lawyer, Martin Caffrey. Jack, Martin's voice was tense. They're expecting your statement in 15 minutes. Just walk in, hand in the resignation letter, and leave. Do not say anything to the press. The last thing we need is you making this worse. Jack exhaled. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell Martin that he was being forced out, that this wasn't fair, that he wasn't a bad cop. But after weeks of backlash, of watching his career crumble, he no longer had the strength to fight. He stepped out of the car. The fall air crisp against his skin. The moment his foot hit the pavement, the shouting began. Jack Reynolds, do you have anything to say about your resignation? Do you regret racially profiling Senator Carter? Will you apologize to the black community? Jack kept his head down. Pushing forward, protesters hurled insults at him. He caught sight of a sign that read, "Accountability or nothing." Another one said, "No justice, no peace." For years, he had dismissed protesters as troublemakers, as people who didn't understand the reality of policing. But now, as their voices rang in his ears, he understood. He had been part of the problem. He pushed through the entrance of the precinct, where Captain Monroe was waiting. Monroe didn't say anything, just handed him a manila folder. "Sign it," he said. Jack opened it, scanning the words. It was his resignation letter, pre-written. Final. His signature was all that was missing. He hesitated. "This is your last chance to walk away with some dignity," Monroe said quietly, "or you can fight this and watch yourself get completely destroyed in court. Your call." Jack swallowed hard. Then, slowly, he signed his name at the bottom of the page. Monroe took the folder and nodded. "You can go now." Jack turned to leave, but as he reached the door, Monroe called after him, "And Jack, I hope you realize this is justice." Jack walked out of the precinct for the last time. Angela Carter sat in her Washington office, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs and policy reports. Her phone buzzed every few minutes, messages from fellow senators, civil rights activists, and reporters eager for a statement. She ignored them all. She was waiting for one call. At exactly noon, her phone rang. She snatched it up. "Vanessa?" On the other end, Attorney General Vanessa Holloway sighed. "We're moving forward with charges." Angela closed her eyes for a brief second, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Are you sure?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "The evidence is undeniable," Vanessa said. "We're charging Jack Reynolds with assault, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power under color of law. He'll be arrested by the end of the week." Angela felt a deep, burning satisfaction settle in her chest. "Thank you," she said. "This isn't just about me, Vanessa. It's about setting a precedent. Officers need to know there are consequences for abusing their power." Vanessa hesitated. "You know this isn't over, right? The police unions are furious. The backlash is going to be ugly." They'll paint him as a victim. Say he was just doing his job. Angela's jaw tightened. Let them. The truth is on our side. The moment she hung up, she turned to Lisa, her chief of staff. Call a press conference, she said. It's time the country knows that justice isn't just for the powerful. It's for everyone. Jack sat in his living room, his television muted. He hadn't left the house in days, afraid of the cameras that lurked outside his property. His resignation had made headlines. But now there was a new story. The Justice Department had officially charged him. His lawyer had called, urging him to turn himself in quietly. But Jack had refused. He still didn't believe he deserved this. He had made a mistake, sure, but did it really warrant criminal charges? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of police sirens outside. His heart pounded as he stood and moved to the window. There were 3 squad cars parked in front of his house. Officers in uniform were stepping out, their hands resting on their holsters. Then he saw Malcolm Harris, the officer who had uncuffed Angela that night, leading the group toward his door. Jack's stomach dropped. A heavy knock shook the door. Jack Reynolds. Malcolm's voice was loud, authoritative. This is the Baltimore Police Department. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door. Jack's body felt frozen. He had been the one knocking on doors, the one making arrests. Now, the roles were reversed. The knock came again, harder. Jack's shoulders slumped. He moved toward the door and opened it. Malcolm looked at him, expression unreadable. Jack Reynolds, you are under arrest for assault, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Jack's face burned with humiliation. Slowly, he did as he was told. The cold bite of steel closed around his wrists. For the first time in his life, Jack Reynolds knew what it felt like to be powerless. The footage of Jack's arrest played on every major news network. Angela Carter sat in her Washington apartment, watching as the former sergeant was led away in cuffs. His head down, his face grim. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about one man. This was about accountability. Her phone rang. It was Lisa. You did it, Lisa said, her voice filled with awe. This is historic. Angela. Angela shook her head. We're not done yet. Lisa hesitated. The police unions are pushing back hard. They're claiming this sets a dangerous precedent, and that officers will be afraid to do their jobs. Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. Good. Maybe they should be afraid. Afraid of consequences. Lisa let out a breath. So, what's next? Angela looked out over the city, the weight of the moment settling over her. Next, she said, determination in her voice. We changed the entire system. The fight was just beginning. And she wasn't backing down. The Baltimore courthouse was swarmed with reporters, protesters, and activists. People held up signs that read, "Justice for Angela Carter. No more bad cops." And, "Accountability is not an option, it's a requirement." The nation was watching as Jack Reynolds, the disgraced former police sergeant, walked into the courthouse, flanked by his legal team. Inside the packed courtroom, Angela Carter sat in the front row, poised, her expression unreadable. This was bigger than her now. This was history unfolding. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. The footage of the incident played on the large screen, showing every moment of Jack grabbing Angela, shoving her, forcing her against her car, and handcuffing her without probable cause. The jury watched in silence, their expressions darkening with every passing second. The prosecutor, Elliot Chambers, turned toward the jury. This case is not just about what happened to Senator Carter, he said. This is about the abuse of power. This is about what happens when those who are supposed to uphold the law decide they are above it. Sergeant Reynolds didn't just make a mistake, he violated the Constitution. Jack sat stiffly at the defendant's table. His lawyer, Martin Caffrey, whispering in his ear, "We need to push the split-second decision argument." Martin muttered, "Make them believe you were acting on instinct. That it was a misunderstanding." Jack barely heard him. He was watching the jury. He could see it in their eyes. They had already made up their minds. His stomach twisted. When it was time for the defense, Martin did his best to paint Jack as an officer who had made a miscalculation. A man who had dedicated his life to public service and was now being villainized. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every argument Martin made crumbled under cross-examination. Then came the worst moment of the trial, when Angela Carter took the stand. She sat straight, unwavering. The courtroom hung on every word. When he grabbed me, when he shoved me, when he humiliated me, I knew this wasn't just about me. Angela said, her voice steady but powerful. This was about every black man, every black woman, who has ever been stopped without cause, harassed, assaulted, or killed by law enforcement. This was about every person who never got the chance to fight back. But I did, and I will not stop fighting. Jack lowered his gaze. He couldn't look at her. The trial lasted for weeks. But in the end, the verdict came faster than expected. The jury foreman stood. The courtroom went silent. In the case of the state of Maryland versus Jack Reynolds, we find the defendant guilty on all charges. The room erupted. Cheers. Cries of relief. Jack felt his world collapse as the words echoed in his mind. Guilty. He would be sentenced in 30 days. For the first time, Jack truly understood what he had done. And it was too late to change it. The sentencing hearing was filled with tension. The nation waited to see if justice would truly be served. Would Jack Reynolds be another officer who walked away with just a slap on the wrist? Or would the system finally hold him accountable? Judge Rebecca Calloway, a sharp-eyed woman with decades of experience, presided over the courtroom. She had seen cases like this before. But this one was different. This one had changed the conversation about law enforcement forever. Jack stood as the judge prepared to read her decision. Mr. Reynolds, Judge Calloway said, her voice even, your actions were not a simple mistake. They were deliberate. You used your power to humiliate, degrade, and unlawfully detain a citizen of this country. That citizen just happened to be a U.S. senator. But let's be clear, had she been an everyday citizen, had there been no camera, had there been no public outcry, we wouldn't be standing here today. And that is why this sentence matters. Jack swallowed hard. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 7 years in prison for unlawful detainment and assault under color of law. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. 7 years. That was unprecedented for a police officer. Jack closed his eyes. His body felt numb. His wife, sitting in the back, covered her mouth in shock. Angela Carter remained still, absorbing the moment. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time in history, an officer was facing real consequences. And the world took notice. Angela Carter walked into the Senate chamber to a standing ovation. Her colleagues, some of whom had initially hesitated to support her, now understood the weight of what she had done. She had fought for justice and won. Lisa Porter, her chief of staff, handed her the final draft of the Carter Law Enforcement Accountability Act. It's done, Lisa said, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. We have the votes. The bill will pass. Angela looked down at the pages. This bill would change everything. It would create a federal oversight committee for police misconduct, enforce mandatory de-escalation training, and establish stricter sentencing for officers who violated civil rights. She walked onto the Senate floor, taking her place at the podium. Cameras from across the country broadcasted her live. I stand before you today not just as a senator, not just as a woman who was wronged, but as an American who believes in justice. She said, we have taken the first step toward accountability. But the work does not end here. We must ensure that this law is only the beginning. We must ensure that justice is not selective. That power does not mean immunity. The Senate chamber erupted into applause as the votes were counted. The Carter Law Enforcement Accountability Act had officially passed. Angela closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. The battle was far from over. But today, they had won. Months later, Angela Carter stood on a stage in front of a massive crowd. She had been invited to speak at the March for Justice in Washington, D.C. Tens of thousands of people filled the streets, holding signs, chanting, demanding more change. She looked out at the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all united for a cause that was bigger than one person. She stepped up to the microphone. This fight does not end with one law, she said. It does not end with one conviction. It does not end today, or tomorrow, or next year. Because as long as one person in this country has to fear those who are supposed to protect them, we still have work to do. The crowd roared in agreement. Angela smiled, feeling something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. Across the country, Jack Reynolds sat in his prison cell, staring at the walls, thinking about every decision that had led him here. He was no longer a police officer, no longer feared, no longer above the law. For the first time in his life, he was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. And for the first time in history, the system had worked the way it should. Angela Carter stepped down from the stage, shaking hands, embracing those who had fought alongside her. She knew there would be more battles ahead. But she was ready. Because justice was not a moment. It was a movement. And she would never stop fighting for it.